Hello, my name is Banka. I'm a clinical geneticist. I work at Manchester University in the UK, and I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to present and discuss some of the work that we've been doing for last 12 to 24 months. So I'm going to talk about Kabuki Syndrome Management Guidelines Project. So just in the previous session, I was talking about all the work that is going on about Kabuki syndrome in Manchester, and this was my first slide. So if you were there in that session, you have already seen it. But just carrying on from here, so the idea behind this project is that there are several hundred papers, peer-reviewed papers that have been published in the medical literature about Kabuki syndrome. So it is a rare disorder, but actually there is a huge amount of information about Kabuki syndrome, which is already known. So this project is about synthesizing all that information into a single document that can then be used for managing, treating patients with Kabuki syndrome. So that's the fundamental idea. And for that, we need help from lots of people. So we have assembled a number of experts. So this project is particularly funded by Kabuki UK organization. So that's their logo at the top. And there are a few familiar faces. I'm sure you know Hans Bodmer, Hans Bronson, Olaf Bodmer, David Geneve, Margaret Adams, Raoul Hennecum, and I couldn't find a photo of Corinne, so I've just put a headshot there. And then we're working together along with Pico Portal and ERN Ithaca on this project as well. So there are multiple steps involved in this project. In the next few slides, I'll quickly try to run through these steps, and then we'll be happy to take any questions. So the first step was to establish a steering group, and that's the steering group in front of you, so which was great. Then we also reached out to a number of patient support groups, including the Kabuki UK organization for funding this project, but there are patient organizations from several other countries, including the US, who are participating in this project. So we're just not collaborating with clinical experts, but we're ensuring that patient and family preferences, voices are there in the project right from inception to ensure that that we're answering questions that families want answered. So once we have done that, the next step is to select themes. So by that we mean there are Kabuki syndrome multiple systems, body systems are affected. So we decided along with patient support groups as to which body systems we are going to dedicate these themes to. And then following from selection of themes, we then selected a number of experts from around the world for each theme. So for example, in this whole project, there are people who are not just experts in Kabuki syndrome, but who are cardiology experts or who are gastroenterology experts or neurology experts. So we're really benefiting from their knowledge and experience as well. Then the next step was to actually do a scoping exercise of what's published, and I think Corinne is going to speak about that part of the project, which is actually a standalone project on its own. And then once you scope the published literature, the next step is to select which of the published literature is eligible for a project like this. And there are multiple criteria, which are pretty standard criteria in the medical field to rate the evidence and suitability of literature. And once you do that, then we have tagged manuscripts according to themes. So which manuscript is suitable for which theme, and that's all done electronically on the Pico portal, which is all thanks to Corinne. And then this is Dr. Ola Abdelhedi, who is one of our genetic clinical genetics trainees in Manchester. And then we've also developed a recommendations form, and it's been quite an intense process. And it's all been, initially we're doing it on different systems, but we've now been able to integrate everything on Pico Portal, which we're just currently trialing the final version. So that's been very helpful, that all the papers, all the tagging, and all the recommendations, all of that can be done on a single electronic system, which can be shared across the world, because we've got experts from virtually every continent on the planet. So we've actually completed the step and the steps which I've just talked about, and everything else I'm going to talk from here on is something that we are going to do over next 12 to 18 months. So once the final trial for our new system is completed, which I'm hoping will be done before the end of this year, we are then going to share the literature library and the recommendations form system with our theme experts, and they are going to evaluate each paper rigorously, rate the evidence, and generate recommendations based on that. Those recommendations will be returned to the steering committee of the project. We also had a step about compilation of clinical data from all stripes. It would be great if it happens, but it may not happen, but it's not absolutely critical to the entire project. But finally, the central board, the steering group, will compile, review, and organize and grade all the recommendations into a single place. And then we will then share the final recommendations with all the theme experts, and then we'll finally have an in-person, it may have to be online, but I think it would be much better to do it in person, an in-person consensus meeting where people can sit together in one place and actually have detailed discussions around which recommendations we should make mandatory, which recommendations could be eliminated, or which recommendations could be optional. So that would be the final, one of the final steps. And once that is done, then we'll draft the consensus document and then share it amongst all theme experts for final comments. And then we're also hoping that the electronic system that we've built can actually be a live database where evidence can be synthesized, evaluated, and accumulated, because there might be X number of publications now, but in 2 years, there will be more information. So we want to make these recommendations almost like a live document where we are benefiting immediately from as soon as the knowledge is emerging. So that is something that has been tried in some other conditions, but it's not really the standard practice. So I think the whole process that we've set up is quite useful and perhaps could be replicated for a number of other rare diseases as well. And finally, our intention is to submit these guidelines to a peer-reviewed journal so that it can be used by that, so that there is any peer review element, but it can also, it helps with dissemination of the guidelines as well across the world. And so that is the full program. And as I said, we are almost halfway there. There's lots more to do, but I think it's taken a lot of work from a lot of people, and I'm thankful to everyone who's on the steering committee and to a number of patient support groups who are already contributing to this effort, and especially to Kabuki UK for funding of this study. That's my Twitter handle. I'm very happy to be contacted by any questions. And that's just one of the a logo for Manchester Rare Condition Center, which we just established last year. So we're really looking forward to see how this project grows. And then hopefully it helps patients and families with Kabuki syndrome, but then it can be replicated, as I said, for many other rare diseases as well. So I'll stop there, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and then we can, I think the next bit is to have a Q&A discussion around this.
Thank you very much, Sid, for the presentation. And for everybody that's participating in this breakout session, I would encourage you to ask any questions and put them in the chat on the breakout, and we can certainly go through those with Sid. So you mentioned that over the next 12 to 18 months, you're going to be making progress. Do you think that you're going to be getting to the end of the timeline that you've laid out in that period of time, or is it likely to take longer when you consider the time for peer review and so forth?
Yes, so I think by 12 to 18 months, I hope that the final recommendations are there. The peer review process often, it can sometimes be very painless and short, but sometimes it can be quite protracted and can take months. So yes, my intention is to have the recommendations in place and then to have written the manuscript draft ready for submission at least.
So when would these guidelines be available for people to begin using? And then when I say people, I mean these would be patients and their patient families to be working with their doctors, with their clinicians that they see. Is this something that would be necessary to wait for would it be necessary for them to wait for the peer review, or is this something that they could already start sharing with the experts that they work with prior to that?
That's a very good question. So what we are also doing, for example, I mentioned ERN Ithaca, which is European Research Network for Intellectual Disability and Malformation Conditions. So if the guidelines are coming under the aegis of ERN Ithaca, then that has an official standing already. Then similarly, we're also working with ACMG, American College of Medical Genetics. So again, their stamp of approval will mean that the guidelines have that approval. So it is not mandatory for guidelines to be peer reviewed as such. So as soon as the guidelines are ready and ACMG and ERN Ithaca say, yep, we're happy with it, those guidelines can be disseminated. I think in an ideal world, you want any of this to also undergo a proper peer review process to ensure the confidence in the suggested recommendations. So in addition to the medical manuscript that we will produce, our intention is also to produce a single or a double A4 sheet simplified version that can be given to busy pediatricians or busy neurologists to say, hey, this is what you want to do if you have a child with Kabuki syndrome or an adult with Kabuki syndrome. So we will ensure that the publication which happens is not behind a paywall, which is, I think, quite important. So that would be freely available to anyone just using an URL. And then the summary document that we produce, we can share that with a number of patient support groups, and that can be easy. We would be happy for that to be put up on your website, for example, if you wanted. Of course, there might be questions around translation, etc., because of course there are many we'll probably produce this in English, and we cannot really control as to how people translate that into their languages, but those are the bridges kind of we can cross probably later on. So my very long-winded answer was that hopefully that you would be able to use the guidelines even pre-publication.
That's great. And will there be an opportunity for the patient community to also have an opportunity to review these guidelines and provide input? Because so many of us have had the experience where we're educating the doctors and the clinicians that we're working with because they either haven't seen many patients with Kabuki syndrome. So it would be helpful, I think, in some ways for there to be a feedback loop for our experience with regards to the sharing information with the clinicians and doctors. Absolutely.
So we already have included representatives of patient support groups. So, in the entire process, which I described just now, it's almost iterative. So people come with recommendations, a group synthesizes it and then takes it back. So at every step of the process, patient support organizations are part of that. And we won't be dictating as to how they want to feedback. So it might be that your organization just says, okay, we're happy with one or two people feeding back, or they can bring it back to the community, take their opinion, and then bring it back to the steering group, as long as it's all done within the required time frame. So yeah, there would be ample opportunity for patients, families, support organizations to influence the recommendations in the document.
That's great. So I've got a question here that I'll read to you. It says, how do you characterize the quote unquote impact of KS on individuals? For example, we use on the spectrum for autism in layman's terms, and KS individuals vary to the impact the syndrome has on them. Is spectrum appropriate? Do some KS individuals have a lesser version of the mutation? How should parents explain it to teachers, etc.?
Yes. So I guess these kind of questions are also part of the guideline that we are developing. In terms of, we all talk about the spectrum, or either autism spectrum, or even there's a spectrum of how severely someone is affected by Kabuki syndrome, right? And it might be that they are more severely affected in terms of how severe the heart defect was, or how severely they are displaying signs of autism spectrum. So it is really very difficult to give like a blanket answer for something like this. I think it is very individual to individual based. I would suggest that for an individual patient, you should reach out to someone in genetics, or someone who has an understanding of Kabuki syndrome, and get your child or your family member evaluated by them. But I don't think it's completely appropriate for me to say, hey, this is how you would answer that question for a particular patient.
And I'll just add, I mean, this is one of the challenges of conducting research and clinical trials and all of this for the Kabuki syndrome community, and that is that the group of patients is very heterogeneous in terms of the issues and challenges that they have. You know, it can affect every one of the body systems for a certain individual, but it may only affect a couple for another. And so it is important for you to work with, you know, clinicians that are expert in this area, because they will have had much greater exposure to the range of impact that Kabuki syndrome has on various patients.
Absolutely. And I presume, Patrick, I understood the question correctly when you talked about spectrum, was talking about autism spectrum.
I think it was comparing, you know, the autism spectrum to Kabuki syndrome. And is there a similar spectrum that exists? And I think you did touch on that, absolutely, that there is a spectrum. Certainly in our experience, you know, being with families at family gatherings and the like, and you certainly see that. I think for some individuals who may not have had experience with others with Kabuki syndrome, you may not have a sense for that. So it is important, I think, to see some of the clinical experts, because I think they will be able to better guide you in that regard. And I would certainly encourage families to, you know, reach out to others in the community, because I think you will definitely find people who've had similar experiences, but you will have others that have had different experiences, given how heterogeneous Kabuki syndrome is.
And just, if I may link it back to the guidelines talk, which I just gave. So guidelines would be, there are certain things which might be mandatory, right? So no matter how severely or mildly you're affected, you must have a echocardiogram or a heart scan soon after diagnosis if it's not been done previously, even if the presentation overall might be very mild. So there are certain things which will be mandatory, and certain other things might depend on presentation of individual patients. So we will keep the spectrum of Kabuki syndrome in our minds while we are drafting these guidelines.
And is it also fair to say, too, that as an individual with Kabuki syndrome ages, the symptoms change, or other symptoms present themselves? So it's not a static situation where once you're diagnosed, those are the limit of the symptoms you might experience. Rather, as a child ages, you may change in terms of the types of symptoms you will experience.
Correct. So we will be making recommendations which would be age specific, or sex or gender specific, or type 1 or type 2 Kabuki syndrome specific as well. So there will be a whole bunch of recommendations which would be uniform across everyone, but then there might be some which are only applicable to females or only applicable to type 2 Kabuki syndrome, for example.
That's great. I mean, the more specificity we have, certainly the more helpful it can be to certain individuals in our community. Well, thank you very much for everyone that participated in this discussion. Hopefully you found this helpful and informative. Certainly, if you have other questions, please submit them in the chat or please submit them to our info@KabukiSyndromeFoundation.org, and we can certainly follow up with you with feedback from all the people that are participating in the conference today. So thank you very much, Sid. We really appreciate your participation throughout the day.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really enjoying this. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And please go back to the main stage. We will be returning to the programming very shortly.